Welcome back to the Faith Forward podcast. John Ackerman, joined today by Pastor Lee Towns, our digital pastor, online campus pastor. I feel like your title changes almost as often as mine does.
In terms of casual usage, it'll work.
That works. You heard him. So in all your emails, that's the address line. So thanks for joining us today, all of you. We're in this series about the power of a name, the names of God, and what they show us, not just about what he's capable of, but who he is and how we can relate to him. And also what that shows us in some ways about ourselves as his children, as the people that are created in his image, as the people that are created by him, as the people that are created to be in relationship with him. So if you missed weeks 1 and 2, you're welcome to go back and check those out. All of them are going to have value and application. They don't build on each other, so if you're catching them out of order, you're totally fine. But in week 1, we talked about the name of God that God reveals to Moses. He reveals himself as Yahweh, the I am that I am. I always go Popeye in my head with that. It just feels so blasphemous, but I can't help it. I blame Warner Brothers. Anyway, and then last week in week 2, we talked about God revealing himself as jealous. And we had to do some redefining of what that word meant, that God is not jealous as in selfish, and God is not envious because, and this drives me crazy, former teacher, words matter. Envious and jealous are not the same word. They're not even synonyms. They mean totally different things, right? Envious is I want what you have. Jealous is I want to keep what I have. God is jealous, zealous to keep the relationship that he created us for and that we agreed to. We're going to have to do some similar, but not the same, defining of the name of God this week. Because the name of God for this week is God as judge. And even as I say that, I know for myself, as I was writing these notes, I have to guess, Lee, for you as you were preparing this message, and for anyone who's hearing either of our voices at any point related to this message and episode, hearing God as judge has to conjure up some initial internal response that I think for most people goes, ugh.
Yeah.
And if you're only hearing the audio, there was a physical cringing movement accompanying that sound. Right? This is almost in some ways a scarier one than God as jealous for some of us.
Yeah.
So, Lee, this is Wednesday. We usually do this Thursday, so this is even earlier in the message development. This is hot off the press today.
It is.
So even more so than usual, we're not going to hold you to anything you said here that you said you'd say on Sunday actually happened. Yeah. But as best as you can guess, what do you think you're going to say on Sunday about God as judge?
Yeah.
And then we'll dive into the practical.
So you hear Popeye on the I am, and I hear I don't even know where it's from. I just know the lyric that goes, "Here come the judge, here come the judge, here come the judge." When I think about this message, and it carries the same weight because when that came on, it was not a good thing. The judge was coming to do just that, to judge, and so there's a weight about it. And you're right. There's a personal journey for myself in this message, and that one of my kind of great processes or growing components in my life is to not see God as the judge and not see him as the negative judge. Yeah. And we'll unfold that a little bit further in the message and in our conversation because, I grew up in a very authoritarian environment. I grew up in a very authoritarian time period.
Sure.
I mean, so it wasn't like my environment was aberrant or different. It was a different culture. I mean, you were taught to fear, those in authority, the law, you know, and therefore, when you begin to think about God as the judge, I heard the phrase, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and I could only think about the fear of God as being, I don't want to get in trouble.
Yeah.
And so I had a very negative, maybe is too strong of a word, but certainly a very distant or austere perspective of God because of this particular role. And so whenever I get a chance to talk about this role with God, I want to be faithful to what is true and talk about some things that are not necessarily comfortable. But at the same time, I want to be able to demonstrate some of the freedom that the Lord's given me in my own journey with him and my understanding of him being the judge.
Yeah.
And in that regard, I thought about this as we anticipated the message. There are a lot of songs about names of God. There are not a lot of songs about God the judge. In fact, probably a lot of people have never even heard the Hebrew name, Shaphet. That's the name of God. And so it's an interesting process to think through this. So in thinking through it, as I have prayed through it, thought through it, studied through it, the Lord kind of has taken me through a progression, and you'll hear that in the nature of the message and what it means for God to be the judge. Because as we talk about the names of God and we identify particular names of God, we are talking about who he is. What God does for us, and this was true culturally in the time period, a name meant something. And it was not simply it meant a wish or a hope that a parent conveyed on their child, but actually it told you something about that person who carried that name. And as is the case with Jehovah Shaphet, we are learning something about God. It's telling us something about God. The first demonstration of the name, or the first expression of the name of God as judge, is found in the book of Judges. In the 11th chapter, there's a judge by the name of Jephthah. And quick story, I'm going to work through it, and I won't tell all the story, but quick story. Jephthah becomes, in the unlikeliest way, becomes the ruler, which is what the judges were. The judges were placed in their position by God to rule over his people prior to the people wanting a king. And so they kind of functioned as the supreme ruler. They kind of functioned as the king, although there were differences, but there was kind of that idea. They were the most powerful person, at the time. So Jephthah finds himself an unlikely recipient of the people's call back to be their leader, because they wanted a leader who could help them stand up against the Ammonites. And so he agrees to that. He gets into the negotiations with the Ammonites as they're getting ready, or they're threatening to attack. And again, we'll talk about those things on Sunday as to what the specifics were. But as he does that, he says, well, here's what's going to happen. You have your own God. The Ammonites worship the god Chemosh, and you get what he gives you. Let him be your judge. But what our God, the Lord God, Jehovah, Yahweh, we will let him be the judge. In fact, he says, the Lord, the judge, is the way it reads in the English translation. So Jehovah Shaphet, actually Jehovah Shaphet, is the way the text in the original language reads. And what he's saying there is whatever he says will be true relative to the outcome. And in that, then he has set the stage for that being the name of God. Now, in the shadow of that, then the Bible kind of unfolds. And we see from cover to cover God functioning as judge. And so the progression for me in my mind was, first of all, God is the judge. And that's a statement about who he is. It's a statement about his character. And there's a lot to say about that, but he is the judge. That is the nature of God. Then, not only is he the judge, he does the judging, because actually Shaphet is a verb. And so it really speaks to the activity of judging, and God does that activity of judging. We see that throughout Scripture, and we kind of make our way through some highlights, but you probably have your own. I mean, it's easy to pick out highlights of where God demonstrates himself as judge. From Genesis to Revelation, you see God doing that. And as we start to break out the role of judges, you start to begin to see, there are even more ways in which God is acting as the judge. And so in that process, I'm just going to ask the question, what is it the judge does? What are those kinds of things? And there are 6 or 7 primary functions a judge fulfills. Some of them are obvious, and we know that. But in the biblical terms, the judge, gave and set law. And God is the ultimate lawgiver. We saw that. We saw that you see through the text in biblical terms that the judge determines right and wrong, particularly in the absence of specific law, because it sounds like those are the same thing. He sets law and he determines right and wrong. But there are times that there is the conflict between right and wrong that is not governed by law. We call some of that ethics, but there are places in our life, those areas where, and we like to kind of work at the margins of that because we call it gray areas where there's not very specific. There might be some general guidance, but you don't break the law if you do it. But in this instance, and in the case of the judge determines right and wrong where there is no law. And I think about a story. I'm not going to talk about it in the message, so this is for podcast only. But I think about the story of Solomon, who is exercising judgment, and he's got the debate between the two moms over the baby. And he's determining where does the baby belong. And we know how the story ends. He says, well, we'll cut the baby in half. And then the real mom shows up. But that's the activity of determining right and wrong. That's what the judge does. The judge also, and we know this because this works in our legal system, the judge enforces the law. So where the law is broken, the judge exercises punishment as it relates to that. The judge settles disputes. Again, reference Solomon. And there are plenty of other ways that we see that. The judge gives direction, particularly in the biblical sense. The judge was pointing the direction. So if you go back and look at the origin of the judges in the book of Judges, God placed the judges there to guide Israel, largely to guide them out of adversity. And so there is a direction that's given. That's where it's a little bit different than our view of a judge in modernity. And he functions a little more like the ruler, like the king. But judges did that. They gave direction. One of the things that I think kind of flies under the surface and we forget, but judges, they defend and vindicate victims. That's still true in our legal system, that if the law works right and the judge exercises the law appropriately, then the victim is protected and vindicated in some way, shape, or form. We see that in God all the time. We see God defending and vindicating those who can't defend themselves. And he reminds us, look, don't worry about vindication. That's mine. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. I'll take care of that. And that's what the judge does. And then one of the things, again, that kind of flies under the surface and we forget, and I think is a very important reminder, at least it has been important for me, is that a judge declares value or worth. If a judge says, for example, in modernity, in the court system, if a judge says the loss of life is worth this much money, they've set a value on that. So when they render a ruling and say this is the settlement that is owed, they've rendered a value and demonstrated a value. Well, in the same way, God renders value through his judgment. And so you see God in the process, and he does judgment, and cover to cover. And we, again, through the message, I'll highlight some of those things. And if you haven't had a chance to listen to the message, by all means, go back and listen to that. But then one of the things that I feel like you have to address is the final progression of the Lord being judge. So he is the judge. He does the judging, but then there is he will judge. And there is a future aspiration. And I actually think that this is a place where or from which we tend to not write songs about God the judge. We've avoided that language. And I, again, because my head's been in this space, I've thought a lot about that whole idea of judging and judgmentalism, and we are a hypocritical culture. If we say we're being judged, we throw our arms up in protest and don't judge me, you have no right to judge me, But at the same time, we practice judgment all the time. And as I've thought about it, I've thought, largely social media is a place where judgment is exercised. Sometimes it is don't judge me and, I'm judging myself. But most of the time, we're scrolling through social media, and whether we do it out loud or we do it internally, we're judging, the value, and we're judging the correctness and all of that kind of stuff. So, but even, taking it further, I at least I intend to mention this in the message. One of the worst things that's happened to the retail culture in our world is the review culture, and And isn't the review culture by its very definition judgment?
It is.
So we say we hate judgmentalism, but at the same time we put ourselves in the position to be judges. But the notion of judging is a harsh notion. And so we avoid that. And I think largely we have avoided that as it related to God. So we don't sing about it, we don't talk about it, and even in the ways that over the decades our narrative has changed, we've avoided that. But God makes very clear that He is the judge, He is judging, and He will judge. And so the text declares that from the Old Testament to the New Testament. We're reminded that there is an accounting coming where God will hold an account. Now I hope you've listened to the message, and if not, I hope you'll at least listen to the end of the message, because there's a beautiful reality about Jesus and the Advent and what He did in His first Advent in preparation for His second Advent. And in simple terms, Jesus came in His first Advent to set Himself up as our defense attorney, to set the case and give us an opportunity to make a plea before the judge, who will render a right and final judgment. But Jesus came to do that. There's a great song that we sang for a long time over the past several years. I haven't heard it in a few years, but that has this line: "The cross stands as my defense." That's what Jesus did in the first Advent. And then the Bible's clear. He, on the second Advent, is coming to judge. And if we have come under the representation of our defense attorney, then the judgment will be not guilty. And if we choose not to be, the judgment has to be guilty, because at the end of the day, the judge is fair. And so there's a beautiful analogy there that if we take God the judge out, we miss the power of the Advent. And so if you haven't heard the message, I hope you listen to that part of it. I think I've preached most of it right here. But one of the things that I love about the process is that it brings me to some, okay, so what do I take away from this statement? And there's a couple things we can go back and visit if you want to. But one of them is, because God is the perfect judge and because He is the supreme judge, that gives me the ability, if I'll trust His judgment, to thrive. And there's all kinds of power underneath that. We can crack that open if you want to, and kind of venture into that. But that's more than 3 or 4 minutes. But thanks for the opportunity to practice my sermon.
That's part of the fun space here.
That's right.
That for anybody that's had the privilege of sharing the message on Sunday, this really has become a wonderfully helpful space of what are the things that I really want people to take away, and especially from a practical standpoint. And so there's a few things that we're going to highlight today. And so as always, again, listen to the entirety of the message, because context matters, like we so often talk about. But one of the things that you were just saying that we're going to park on first is, if we really want to take our faith forward, we have to learn how to approach and interact with God as judge.
Yes.
We can't skew in the direction of, well, I don't like that.
Right.
So let's just ignore that facet of God. Nor do we want to skew in the other direction of God the great and terrible, God the one who punishes, God the one who convicts, God the one who's just mean and judgmental. Sort of like we talked about last week with God is jealous. We had to redefine what that word meant. God is not judgmental.
No.
In the way that we would use that word in the 21st century context. God is not judgy.
Right.
Who God is someone who is empowered to judge, because He's the creator of all things. Right. This is not a lesser deity. This is the one who made it all. And so He's the only one that has the power and authority to judge. He's also the only one capable of judging. Right? He's the one that told us through Jesus, we shouldn't judge, or else we will be judged according to the same measure or standard that we use. And He's highlighting there, it's not a don't be bad. It's not a bad behavior. It's you don't see clearly. He shows us throughout the scriptures, right? He shows Samuel. Samuel's looking to anoint the next king of Israel, and Samuel's looking at all of David's brothers and going, these guys look stellar. And then David shows up, and it's like, really, this guy? And God reminds him, You're looking at things differently than I am.
Right.
You're looking at the outside, I'm looking at the inside.
Right.
Jesus echoes this throughout his time on earth.
Right.
You're whitewashed tombs. You look fantastic on the outside. I'm looking at the inside. And so he's reminding us, when you judge, you inherently look at the outside. When I'm looking at the inside, you inherently use a metric of performance.
Yeah.
And that's not the way that I look at things. Although I have established a standard of performance that will not change, but you typically like to take a subset of that standard of performance and apply sort of a false comparison paradigm.
Right.
So he's the only one empowered. He's the only one capable. And Isaiah talks about God's thoughts being higher than our thoughts. That's part of why he's the only one capable. He looks at things differently. His ways are higher.
When that's embedded in, so whenever we look at a name of God, there is the name, Yahweh or Jehovah, both being the same. But that's the name of God. The only other name that stands alone is Elohim. But when we look at a name of God, like in the instance of Shaphet, we look at it as Jehovah Shaphet. This is God the judge.
Right.
And in that God side, the Yahweh side, there is power and there's permanence and there's perfection that qualifies him to be the judge. Here's something that I think about and I've had to process through as I've ventured into my own journey of being comfortable in relating to God as my judge. And comfortable not for the sake of my own personal comfort, but comfortable in that I could stand on a firm foundation and feel like his judgments are not harsh, they're good. To get to that place and see that, I had to recognize in my own life that God has the authority, God has the final say, God has the right. And what I realized when I started processing that is that my problem was that I was doing the wrong kind of comparison. So I was saying, here's judge, whatever, fill in the blank, that wears the dark robe, sits behind a bench, has a gavel, and this is what they do. And now I know the stories of the personalities, or I know of some stories of the personalities of the people who wear those robes, hold that gavel, and sit in that seat. And I start going, God is like that, God is like that, God is like that. We do that with God the Father. The same way, where we go, okay, I'm going to look at my Father, and that must be what it means when God is called Father. I look at my Father and define God by my Father, rather than defining my Father by God, rather than defining the judges by God. And so what I struggled with, one of the things that I struggled with in understanding and relating to God as my judge, was that I was looking at human judges and going, here's the unfair application of the law. Here's the harsh response of the law. And I didn't have this sense from a human and modern expression of a judge, of the judge being compassionate. In fact, my view was the judge was harsh, and the judge was looking for how they could exact pain and suffering and loss on those that they were ruling against. And you can start to unwind that and go, this is why this is unhealthy to view God that way. And so when you look at God the judge, and we start talking about he's empowered to judge and he's capable of judging, you start to realize when God comes to being the judge, he brings the full force of his character to it. And so if God is the judge, he is also love, and he is also our Father, and he is operating with all of those things in perfect balance. And he is more qualified to be the judge, and he is more capable of being the judge than any human expression there is. And so that brings great solace when we start talking, he's the only one that's empowered. He's the only one that's capable. We're not going to have a scandal behind the judge's bench.
Right. And I love how you called out the other aspects of God that have to be taken into consideration as we look at God as judge. That if we've also learned God as Father, as he means Father. If we look at God as Redeemer, as he's introduced himself as Redeemer, it creates a very different picture of the kind of judge he is. And it brings us to this other reality that he's judging for a reason, and it's not just to exact punishment, but it's instructive. Right? It's purposeful. It's not just punitive. And one of the things that we have to be reminded of is we're made in his image. He's not made in ours,
Right.
like you were
Right.
calling out.
Right.
And because we're made in his image, we have to learn to think like he does,
Yeah.
to look at the world like he does. And so part of why he's judging, again, it's not, even that word is just so loaded, you can't use it without painting a word picture. But when he is judging, it's illustrating, it's demonstrating what is true and what is not, what is good and what is not, what is right and what is not, so that we can learn. It's the same way that you model things for a small child.
Right.
It's the same way that you would teach a child, this is how you say this word. And they say it back in whatever version their 2, 3, 4, 5-year-old, brain and mouth can comprehend. And then you gently correct until they're saying the word the right way.
Yeah.
Right? This is part of what God's judgment is meant to do. It's not to put people in spiritual jail.
Right.
It's to show them what is good, what is right, what is real. This isn't just forced submission to a tyrant. Mm-hmm. This is learning from the designer.
Yeah.
This is the instruction manual of the product that I buy that tells me how to use the product correctly.
Right.
Which is why we make fun of people that just throw out the instructions like, I'll figure it out for myself. That's I mean, you can try it.
Yeah, and it's resident in that quality of a judge or that function of the judge where the judge directs and guides.
Yeah.
And yeah, we can talk about motive in a minute or two if you want to, but he directs and guides.
Yeah.
Because he knows.
He knows. So the next thing we're going to talk about is if we're going to take our faith forward, we have to become aware of where we've learned the Father wrong, which we talked about in week 1, where Brian and I were talking about God revealing himself as Yahweh. And I referenced this quote from the Scottish author, poet, preacher, George MacDonald. It ought to be a startling thought that we may have learned him wrong. That must be far worse than not to have learned him at all.
Yeah.
And so one of the things, and we've touched on this briefly, but let's dig into this a little bit further. We have to dig into what our heart has come to believe regarding God and regarding God and judgment.
Yeah. And that's exactly what my journey's been, is I need to relearn, what does this look like?
Right.
Because what I realized was I had a very one-dimensional, and that's probably the right way to say it, perspective of a judge, or what it meant for God to judge. And that one dimension ignored some other really important parts of that brought to bear the value of that one dimension. It didn't negate that one dimension, which I think is one of the things that what we've tried to do in anesthetizing this idea, and therefore avoiding even the label altogether of God being the judge, is that we've said, here's this one slice. This is and it really comes down to like a moment or two in a courtroom drama.
Right.
It's the gavel hitting the bench and saying guilty or not guilty.
Right.
And it all resides on that one thing.
Yeah.
But so much more happens on the part of a judge than just the banging of the gavel and the declaring of the verdict. And really, if you understand the activity of a judge, the declaration of the verdict is really a function of just expressing the law.
Right.
So it's almost done.
It's
for
correct
the
interpretation
judge.
of. It's not just willy-nilly.
Exactly. And so in learning wrongly, to say it as bluntly as I know how to say it, in learning wrongly about God being the judge, all I could see was the verdict renderer. And therefore, then I talked about this in the message. I started viewing God as the police officer setting the speed trap. That he was looking for something that he could say, guilty, guilty, guilty.
Yeah.
And that's just not the nature of God.
Yeah.
And when you start to realize and you start to learn that God, again, one of those great other functions is God's the direction giver. God knows the way. His ways are higher than ours. His understanding is greater than ours. God knows the way. And as judge, he's coaxing us. He's guiding us. He's pushing us. He's helping us move in the right direction, because God is our Father and God is love, and his desire for us is not to render a guilty verdict, but instead to render a not guilty verdict, and for us to experience a thriving life because we've heard his counsel and we've responded to his counsel. And when that dimension and those other nuances of God the judge start to open up, I now have much more confidence, as the writer of Hebrews would say, approaching the throne of grace, approaching the bench, and standing before the judge, because I'm not simply standing there saying, render a verdict and give me my punishment, but I'm actually standing there saying, speak over me the things I long to have. Speak value over me. Vindicate me, O God. Give me direction. Speak wisdom to me. Yeah. And you hear that in David's heart, right? Yeah. I mean, you hear it through the Psalms where he would say very directly, I referenced it, vindicate me, O God. How many times did David say that? Be the judge and vindicate me. But he also guide my steps, rebuild me, lead me in the way everlasting. Those are all phrases and functions of a judge. Yeah. And that's a whole new dimension and a whole different relationship. Now I want to be in front of the judge's bench. Right. I'm not avoiding that. I'm not fearing that, other than the reverence kind of fear. Yeah.
Yeah. And so this is a really helpful place for you to sit and invite God to show you your story, because chances are good what you learned about God as judge had nothing to do with any legal experiences that you had, because so much of this was formed by your experiences with authority early in your life. Yeah. So unless you happen to spend a lot of time in the courtroom as a 3 to 12-year-old, which may be the case for some people,
but hopefully
this
not.
has more to do, right?
Yeah.
This has more to do with where and how you experience the use of authority, right? So in the home that you grew up in the school that you grew up in, playing the sports that you played as a kid, did you experience things like never good enough? That what you learned from authority figures was sort of the speed trap, right?
Right.
There's always something to catch you on, right? It's never good enough. And so why would I want to approach God as judge if nothing I do is ever good enough? Yeah. And there's an element of truth to that, and we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later. But if that's my learned experience of authority, why would I ever approach authority? Or maybe it was living under punishment, right? It wasn't just looking for wrongdoing, but it was the execution of judgment about that lack or incorrectness or wrongdoing was met with swift and severe punishment.
Yeah. I think about just interjecting here. I think about that sometimes and listen, to people say, flippantly. I know they don't mean this in this moment. I better not say that, or lightning will strike.
Right.
But then there are ways in which we make those declarations in truth. Yeah. Right. That we think, I'm sick because, or I've got calamity because, and this is God looking for a way to punish me, and we forget that our God, the judge, is a long-suffering God. Yeah. That's a quality about him, that he is patient, he is long-suffering. And look at the numbers of times that you read through the narrative of the story of God, and God is ready to execute judgment, but he is giving opportunity. So God delays the punishment aspect of the judge as far as he can. I mean, I'm always struck. I teach a class about studying the Bible, and as we talk about that, we do an overview of the Bible. When we get to the Old Testament, I'm always struck by how often God says, I'm going to give you a warning. Through the prophet, he says, I'm going to give you a warning. Don't do this. If you'll relent, if you'll repent, if you'll turn away from this. It's one of the frustrations of Jonah's life, right? Jonah, a very short book at the very end of the Old Testament, Jonah is called by God to go to Nineveh because judgment is coming. Right. That's his pronouncement. I mean, I can almost see Jonah carrying the cardboard sign.
He's pretty
repent,
psyched.
Judgment's coming. Yeah. And Jonah goes, not me. I don't want to do this. Yeah. And the reason he doesn't want to do it. This is the amazing part of this, and this is what brings to bear what I'm trying to say about relearning who the judge is, and us taking the time to relearn it. Jonah says to God, "I'm not going to Nineveh." Now you need to understand, Jonah hates Nineveh because the Ninevites are the oppressors of Jonah's people, and here's his cause. I'm not going to do this, God, because I know how you are. Here's what's going to happen. They're going to repent, and you're going to let them off the hook. Yep. Now, tell me that's the picture of a judge that reflects accurately against our, lightning's going to strike.
Right.
Jonah is resistant. And then as we watch it, we see, okay, so Jonah goes, ultimately, the big fish story, he goes to Nineveh and they do repent and God does relent.
Right.
And for 150 years, the Ninevites are okay until at that point, the Assyrians have come in and they've returned to their ways, and then God brings judgment.
Right. And so this is potentially another place where in your story, it might be worth exploring that sometimes we think God just bluffs when it comes to judgment. Yeah. And that may have been what you experienced with authority earlier in life as well. There were lots of rules, but there was never any follow through. There were lots of you better not, or you shouldn't, or if you do this, and then there was always a reason why. Yeah. Right. Or maybe it felt like there was double standard. Yeah. Yeah. Right?
And it's both sides of that. It's either he's can't wait to beat me,
right,
or he's not going to do that.
Right. And we see that with some of the perception of God as judge. And you were talking about this on Sunday, that, we point to Jesus saying, I didn't come to judge the world. Right. Right. And yet that is part of his story, just not at that point. But we've highlighted that section and go, well, he didn't really mean it. Yeah. He's all about love. He's all about grace. He's all about mercy. He's all about forgiveness. And he is, but not to the exclusion of all the other things that he said about himself and that God said about himself. But again, some of us learned authority as something that was never exercised. Right. That's something that was overly permissive. And so be curious, right? This is where we take our faith forward. Be curious about your story and what it taught you about authority and how you've applied that lived experience. Because again, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. Mm-hmm. This is not only about intellectual understanding. This is not only about doctrinal understanding. This is about your lived experiences have taught you something that affects the way you live and interact with God. Yeah. And if we don't come to terms with that, it's either going to change the way that we interact with God in an unhealthy way, or it's going to create the very kind of separation that God has been moving heaven and earth to rectify. Yeah. And so it may be...
And you have to, and maybe this is a good segue to the next part. You take me where you want to take the conversation. But I think about this and think, at the core of this, I need to trust God as the perfect judge. Yeah. And it's really kind of ironic. We trust God when he tells us the bad stuff. Yep. Like we trust God to send lightning, or we trust God to say, here you have failed. Here you are, whatever.
Falling
fill in
short.
the blank.
Yep.
Yeah. And we trust that verdict as long as it's negative. But God the judge has also rendered verdicts that are positive. And we challenge that. So when God says, you're the apple of my eye, when God says, I rejoice over you with singing, when God says, I so loved you that I would send my very self in the form of my son, we go, that can't be true. Not about me. Not about me. And so we don't trust his judgment. And so when we get a holistic view and a healthy perspective and understanding of God the judge, we are opening up the opportunity that his judgments negatively about us can guide us into the right living, but his judgments positively about us are just as true.
Right. Yeah, it's the TV courtroom drama where the judge, bangs the gavel and says, I rule in your favor. Yeah. And you won, and you stand up and say, I object. Right? Like, you would never do that. Exactly. You would never do that. And yet you're exactly right. That's what we do. Yeah. That's exactly what we do, because we've become so myopically focused on the negativity of a judgmental God that we've missed all of the judgments, all of the decrees, all of the promises that God has ordained for us as part of this relationship, because he's not just God is judge. God is jealous about and zealous about this relationship that he moved heaven and earth for. And so, like you said, he's declared me adopted. He's declared me worthy. He's promised to guide and direct my steps towards peace, towards purpose, towards legacy. He fights for me and he defends me. He promises that he knows the paths of life and that he's inviting me into that, That he has judged, this is good, and I have also judged, I want you to have it. Right. And we're like, No. Right? Why would you do that? Why would you do that?
Yeah.
And another place where I see this word judgment pop up in the New Testament, and I find it really interesting, it's in Hebrews 4. And if you've been around church a little bit, you've probably heard this before.
Yeah.
That the word of God, the logos of God, is alive and powerful. It's sharper than the sharpest two-edged sword, cutting between soul and spirit, between joint and marrow, and it judges our innermost thoughts and desires. And even there, I think most of us have heard that as a blanket negative statement that everything I think is wrong and all of my desires are wrong. And yet, that's not true.
Right.
If we are supposed to be becoming more like Christ, if we are supposed to be developing the mind of Christ, then that means some of your thoughts are actually in line with His.
Right.
And some of your desires,
increasingly so.
Right.
Yeah.
And some of your desires are actually in line with His, and He gave them to you.
Right.
And so He's judging that some of what is in you is intentional and good and purposeful and valuable and moving in the right direction.
So one of the times that God exercises the character of judgment that we don't think about is in Genesis 1. Mm-hmm. And He creates and He says, that's good.
That's good.
That's a judgment statement.
It is.
That's a ruling of the judge.
It is.
And He says, that's good. That's good. That's good. 6 days or 5 days, He says, that's good. On the sixth day, on the last day, He creates man and woman. And He looks at them and He goes, that's not just good. That's very good. Yeah. That's a judgment.
That's a judgment.
But the very first chapter of the Bible is God rendering positive judgments. Yeah. Now, and Scripture will go on and give us descriptions of God as the judge. They'll describe Him as the righteous judge. They'll describe Him as a holy judge. Scripture will describe Him or His judgments as good and true. That rarely, if ever, I won't say never, because I can't with integrity say I've done a comprehensive search of this, but you don't see your judgments are harsh, your judgments are unfair, your judgments are unscrupulous, your judgments are flawed. Yeah. That's not the description. They're righteous, they're right, they're holy, they're good, they're wise. Yeah, and one of the things that I have to do because of my orientation is that I have to pause and I have to first say I trust the judge, who is perfect, who is permanent, and who is powerful. Yeah. I trust Him. And He is not just the judge, He's my Father, and He is the embodiment of love. And out of those things, His character is in perfect balance. And so His judgments come from those places. Yeah. And not only do I trust His judgments, but He has declared good things. Yeah. His judgments are positive. Yeah. And sometimes a great discipline for me, because I know often we like to talk about what's the practical walkout of the message. Sometimes a great discipline for me, because of my orientation, is for me to pause and just sit down and say, what are the good judgments God has made about Lee? Yep. And just be reminded that He looked and said, that's good. Yep. That's good. Yep. You're valuable. But one of the things that I have to pause and I have to make sure that I'm living from is that God has declared value, and God has the power just by the force of His ruling to make something valuable. Yeah. And He doesn't have to add, some kind of touch to it. Like His declaration of value is not based on market trends. His declaration of value is not based on consumer desire. Yeah. His declaration of value is found in His word. So if God says it's valuable, it is inherently valuable. Yeah. And so for a pivotal moment right here, God says you are valuable. He says, I am valuable. We are His prized possession when we come under His grace. And He looks at us and declares as the judge, this is valuable. Yeah. That's a different view of a judge. That's an entirely different view of a judge. And I've got to force myself to go back to that place. Yeah. Because again, my view of judge was guilty. Right. Guilty. Yeah. And I have to go back and go, oh wait, He's saying good. Yeah. Valuable. Yeah. Not guilty.
Yeah. Guilty almost seems like it would be an easier sentence to live under, and it's harder to live under the sentence of good. It is. And so like you said, one of the most practical things we can do is practice reminding ourselves of the good judgments. And remembering, and Brian and I geeked out about this in week 1 a little bit, that when God says good, it's good that creates good, that begets good, that begets more good, that begets more good. That's part of what makes God's judgments good, is not just that they're lawful, but they're creating good. That creates more good, right? His declaration that you are worthy, that you are loved, has a generative effect. And that's part of why we need to be reminded of the good judgments. And then one last thing on this, that, Jesus in Matthew said, judge not, lest ye be judged. And sometimes you just got to say the lest ye. Like it lands.
It feels better, doesn't it?
But then Paul says this in 1 Corinthians, as he's talking to the Corinthian church about, when you have disputes with one another, like, don't actually take it to court in front of a human judge. Don't you realize, this is verse 2 of chapter 6 in 1 Corinthians, don't you realize that someday we believers will judge the world? Right? It's a mind-blowing recognition of, in part, what we talked about at the very beginning, with what God is doing. He's not just meting out punishment. He's showing us reality. He's showing us this is good. Do you see it? Do you see why I call this good? This isn't so good. Do you understand why? Do you understand why this is inferior to what I'm calling good? Because you're going to need to know this. Because you have a role to play. Right? It's the thing that I started to recognize in myself. I knew I wanted to be a teacher since the 8th grade. And what I started to recognize that I was doing was I was attending school as a student, but I was starting to observe as someone who intended to be a teacher. And it fundamentally changed the way that I engaged with the experience of school. I was trying to survive it. Let's just be honest. Everybody's trying to survive middle school and high school. Right? I was trying to survive it, but I was surviving with an eye towards not only enduring, but practicing. I need to take away more from this because I have a role to play here in the future. And it's exactly this that God also has in mind as a good judge. It's an invitation to join him in the work of the kingdom, which is God's invitation throughout the scriptures. All of this is purposeful. All of this is purposeful because I'm inviting you into not only relationship with me, but purpose with me, right? Jesus saying, you're going to do what I did and possibly even some greater things, right? There's purpose to this. There's initiation to this. Pay attention, not just passively, like, duck your head and, run for cover, but actively participate in this process because you have a role to play. And for me, that's another thing that fundamentally shifts my understanding of God as judge back to God as Father who is judge. That if my dad was a judge and I had any aspiration of going into the family business, I would probably go to court and watch my dad and watch how he did it and how he treated people and how he interacted and ask him questions about, Dad, how did you arrive at this decision? Because I want to do what you do. And that's part of the invitation that our Father is extending to us.
And it's important for us to keep in mind that whatever God is doing in us, and I use that word whatever, not flippantly, because what God's doing in you is different than what God's doing in me. So each of us, God is doing stuff, but whatever it is in us that He's doing, He's not simply doing it for this life, but He's doing it for the life yet to come, which kind of begs the question, and this is the part that if we talk about God the judge, we tend to lop off. And that's not only is He judge and does He judge, but He will judge. And there is a role that He will play as judge at the end,
Yeah.
Or the end of this life and the transition to the next. And we know that creedally. We talked for a moment at the end of the message about creeds. We know that creedally, but from Old Testament to New Testament, we're reminded he will come and judge the world. There is a time. But if we broaden out our understanding of judgment, yes, there is the execution of the law.
Right.
That's a part of that, where the judge will sit behind the desk and the gavel will sound, and guilty or not guilty will be proclaimed. And, as I mentioned earlier in the first, second advent, there is, if we've come under the defense of the cross, then there is the not guilty verdict. And those who don't come under the defense of the cross, there is the guilty verdict. Mm-hmm. And that judgment is coming. We cannot avoid it. We can stick our head in the sand, but it doesn't make the world less real. And so judgment is coming. But if you broaden it out past the bench, what I love about the full circle of this, if you go back to what I said about how the judges were established, they were established as God's representation as ruler. And then I mentioned the fact that then they demanded a king. And there's this debate in Samuel where the people are asking for a king, and God says, you don't need a king. And they said, we want a king. Everybody else has a king. Right. And God gives all the reasons why they don't want a king. But in the middle of the debate, where they're asking God for a king and God's trying to persuade them not to go the route of a king, God says, I will be your king. And he doesn't say, I will be your king in that he hopes to win an election. He says, I will be your king because up till that point, he had been their king. Mm-hmm. He had been their ruler. And there is a God will judge in that God will be the ruler. And he will invite us to rule with him. Yeah. He will invite us to restore or to resume that which he created Adam and Eve. If you remember, there is a word in the first couple of chapters of Genesis that gets used as it relates to Adam and Eve, dominion. Mm-hmm. And there is this ruling over that God assigns to Adam and Eve that has been broken because of sin, and God is preparing us for the restoration of that role of ruling, of judging alongside our ultimate king.
Yeah. Have you learned to discern what's true and what's not?
Yeah.
Have you learned to recognize what's real and what's not, what's good and what's not?
Yeah.
Not because you're just sitting on the bench, but because that's how we're all meant to live in the kingdom.
Right.
And so we finished the last 2 episodes with this thought, and I'll probably continue to finish the remaining episodes for all 9 weeks with this thought. But that the power of a name and the value of a name comes in understanding who God says he is rather than what we think he should do. Mm-hmm. And so in this series on the names of God, there's a temptation to see it potentially as a buffet of things that I can either get or should avoid when it comes to God. And so if God is judge, just do what he wants and no one gets hurt, right? Which is similar to what we talked about last week with jealous, that if God is selfishly jealous, then just do what he wants so nobody gets hurt.
Right.
And that's not the invitation. Right. God reveals his name to show us what he can do through connection rather than through transaction. Mm-hmm. And so look at the good that he has judged us worthy of receiving because of Jesus. And look at the good that he's inviting us to learn to judge correctly as we take our places in his kingdom. Mm-hmm. And so as we continue week after week to take our faith forward, to learn even more of who God says he is and who he's created us to be, that's the invitation this week. This is part of who he is, and we can't get away from it, and we can't make it be what we want it to be. But the good news is who he says he is as judge is ultimately a good thing.
It is, and it is just as good as he being our provider, as he being our healer, as him being our redeemer. It is just as good. We have to embrace that.
So, as always, thank you for being a part of our journey. Thank you for giving us space to talk through things that we're processing.
Thanks for letting me practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for playing in the sandbox with us, because that's really what this space is. So, Lee, it's always a pleasure to have you here, my friend.
Great to be here,
I appreciate it. And again, for all of you that allow us this space, that allow us this influence to whatever extent in your spiritual growth, in your transformation, it is truly a privilege. We don't take that lightly, because it is one of the most valuable things that we could ever invite somebody into, is to play that kind of role in our transformation. So from all of us here, Lee, Brian, Mike, me, Rochelle, Brooke, all of us that have had the privilege of sitting in these chairs and in front of these cameras, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll see you next time.